All right, good morning. My name is Sadie McKeown. I am the president of the Community Preservation Corporation. I've been working at CPC since 1991, and for 22 years I was a loan officer in the field, investing in small and medium-sized multifamily housing in very distressed neighborhoods. And so with my knuckles white, I have a really granular understanding of what it takes to change the condition of multifamily buildings and create affordable housing. And I'm going to acknowledge right up front how very, very difficult that is. Here we are in my career, 32 years, looking at an inflection point. I want to shout out the prior panel. Just a terrific conversation to set up this discussion, and just be so grateful for fresh eyes and really smart new leadership at this moment in time. It's exactly what our industry needs, and I'm really excited to partner with everyone that was on the prior panel, my panel, and all of the future panels for the work ahead, because it's significant. I also just, of course, also have to say, I love you, Buzz. I mean, I really, since I've been at CPC, Buzz has been a fixture in our institution, and I know he's been important to all of us from when he was at Treasury, and just that calm and wonderful voice on the other side of the phone, helping solve problems, bring issues forward. Could always rely on Buzz, just one of the smartest, most well-intended, kindest, persistent people in our industry. So thank you for everything, and congratulations on your retirement. All right, so our panel is to talk about the climate opportunity. Some of this was said in the prior panel, but it bears repeating. Climate change is here, and it is rapidly accelerating. Harold's points about the number of storms that we have seen, the increase in the number of storms that we have seen over the last 2 decades, cannot be overstated. $2 billion storms in 2002, 28 last year. Okay, this is a significant problem, and it is accelerating. And we're seeing the impacts. They are both physical and they are economic. To Sean's great point, insurance prices are out of control, in large part because of enormous claims being paid out due to climate impact. And there are more and more physical locations where we would love to develop housing that are being marginalized because of heat, because of storms, and because of fires. At the same time, volatile energy costs are impairing affordability significantly, and we have to get that under control. Sean also made the great point that the climate opportunity stands to provide tremendous affordability to people in the future, not today, but in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And when I make this point, I like to think back to 2008 when CPC launched its Green Financing Initiative at a time of the Great Recession, when oil was $150 a barrel. And so our initiative focused on just making buildings more energy efficient so that owners could save money and not impair affordability and take pressure off of rents, right? And so that 150 over the next, say, 7 years came down to $30 a barrel. It was one of the largest housing subsidies during that 10-year period, the cost of oil. You don't think of it that way, but when you do, it's remarkable. And so we have to think of energy as a really component, intimately connected component part of affordability. So transitioning to a clean energy economy is also, it's underway, it's begun. For buildings, it's been remarkably slow. But it has started to accelerate, and a number of the opportunities in front of us will hasten that acceleration. We have to be ready. Our industry has been called upon to be ready and to take advantage of this opportunity with integrity and with justice and with the neighborhoods that we serve in mind. And so we all come at our work with tremendous passion and mission. Climate now has to become part of our mission. We must walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to address sustainability and climate alongside of affordability and justice. We don't have a choice. I second Harold's call to all CDFIs to step up and embrace this. And I see him, one, by asking all banks to do the same. It is not right that the federal government has put this burden on the nonprofit financial sector while the private sector gets to sit by and wait to see how we do. We all have to do this together. We have often been a leader where the private sector has not wanted to go first. Think about the neighborhoods that Sean talked about that were burning in the 1970s. We weren't CDFIs then, but we went in first. Nonprofit lenders, community development organizations, CBOs, we were there on the front end of the spear to show the banks that it could be done, and that it would be done, and that it should be done, and it's been done. There's still a lot of problems to solve, don't get me wrong, but the Bronx is no longer burning. And the banks are making a lot of money from the residents who live and work and have businesses in those neighborhoods. So it can work and it does work, and it's our time to step up and take advantage of this opportunity. So economics and the appropriate sources of financing have been huge barriers in this transition to decarbonized housing. Those barriers exist alongside of inconsistent government priorities. I held back, but I so badly wanted to ask the senator from Indiana if with those tax credits, they could also require that all of those homes be constructed to net zero standards. I shouldn't have held back, but I did. I was trying to be polite, because you never know where you're going to step in DC. So there's a lack of consistent energy code. Our building codes across the country are disparate and inconsistent. There is a general lack of awareness. People don't know this is happening. They don't know it's coming. And they don't know what it looks like. It's hard to see, especially in buildings. And the transition is also punctuated by a lack of resources to support this. And I'm talking to a room full of people who understand that when market economics don't provide, the federal government has to be there with support. We see that in affordable housing, absolutely every day. Market forces don't work, so you get I approved a deal yesterday, had 10 sources of subsidy, 10. And that's not a record, that's pretty common, right? And when the government has a priority for something, they make resources available. The government has a priority for decarbonizing the built environment and for transitioning us to a clean energy economy. For the first time ever, they've made resources available through the IRA and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and it is very, very exciting. I want to point out another example that I often point to, which is historic preservation. I think we all agree that historically preserving buildings in old cities in this country is fantastic for economic development. It's wonderful. I'm on the credit committee for a small green bank in New York City, and we approved a deal the other day. Now, this is a green bank, and I was pushing for them to get the owner to make the building all electric. And in the sources and uses, there was $12 million for historic preservation and $2 million for energy upgrades. We at least have to have the same priority, right? We can't ignore that this is a big priority. And, to the topic, it drives great opportunity. So, affordable housing has been a leader in sustainability. You all know that. And it's very hard work. If you've tried to finance a deal on an existing building to get it to all electric systems, it's hard to do. But that's what we do. We do hard deals. I mean, this is our life, this is our work. We know how to do this, so we have to do more. And saving the planet, frankly, is mission consistent with supporting our most vulnerable populations. I mean, it just is. We cannot afford to leave poor people behind as we transition to clean energy. These are the populations most impacted by the negative effects of climate change, and they have the least ability to bear the economic impacts of climate disruption. If we leave folks behind on an outdated, dirty grid, we are doing them a tremendous disservice socially, but we are also, and economically, but we are also brutalizing the taxpayer, who will have to then subsidize those units for the high cost of energy that they will bear, not just to pay their utilities, but to pay for far fewer people on a dirty grid, it will be the government's responsibility to maintain those grids because we haven't transitioned the poorest people onto clean energy grids. We just can't afford to do that. So the Biden administration has thrown down a gauntlet and said, for the first time ever, you now have a sources of capital, both on the debt side as well as on the credit side, to support the clean transition. And you in the nonprofit sector, we're giving you the opportunity to lead the way because you have integrity and because we know you'll come together, you'll collaborate, you won't compete. Even though we're all competing in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, it's kind of co-opetition. We all recognize that whoever wins, we ought to do this together, and every person in the CDFI community has to participate. And so there's a lot of opportunity in front of us. Today's panel is going to address this opportunity. We're going to hear from an expert in energy and an expert in tax credits. We're going to hear from an expert from HUD and an expert in policy. So we're going to cover the gamut, and they are really, really smart. And the people that you need to hear this from, they're going to have slides. So this is a conversation that we'll have, but you really need to see the information because there's a lot here. So the thing that I will finish with is something that I started with, which is if we have a goal in this country to transition the built environment to all electric, we have to move the mortgage markets, the first mortgage markets. As a first mortgage lender for multifamily properties for 32 years, the way you transition the physical condition of a building is not with an incentive from the utility company, and it is not with an off-balance sheet product from a green bank. It is from your first mortgage lender who provides you the capital that you need to transition your systems, to replace your windows, to add your solar to the roof, to add electric to the building so you can do EV charging. It is the first mortgage lender who has the responsibility of transitioning to all electric housing. And unless and until it becomes a routine part of what we all do, we'll never get there. So this money, this opportunity is about animation and instruction. It's about showing first mortgage lenders how to do this and giving you a carrot to support the work that you do so that we can all end up doing it together. Costs are high now, demand goes up, costs come down, and this becomes routine. We didn't know how to remove asbestos once upon a time. We do that routinely. Same with radon, same with taking tanks out of the ground, lead paint remediation, handicap accessibility. All of those things were required, and we figured it out. This one's harder. That's why there's billions of dollars coming in to support it, but we're going to figure it out together. So with that, I'm going to ask Janet Joseph to step up and talk to us about what it looks like to try and decarbonize buildings, because I'll finish again with it's not easy.
Thank you, Sadie. Up to the podium.
Yep.
Okay, well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here and to address the climate opportunity and the climate challenge, really trying to bring together two crises that we need to resolve simultaneously, the affordable housing crisis and the climate crisis. I've been working on issues of clean energy and climate mitigation for the better part of 30 years. And I want to pick up on one point about this imperative, and that has to do with timing. And then I promise we'll talk about the opportunity. I don't want this to be all gloom and doom, but there's a timing element here that we all really need to appreciate. So you've heard we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Scientists across the globe strongly recommend that we have to reduce those emissions within the next 20 years. Right? We have to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 50, 60, 70, 80% within the next 20 years. Well, what does that mean when we look at a physical asset like a building? It's the lifetime of one piece of heating equipment that you put in, right? So the next project that you develop, you have to ask yourself, is that building consistent with a decarbonized world? The next furnace or boiler that we put in our own homes, we have to say, is a device that uses fossil fuel consistent with what we need to do to preserve this planet. I started working on this issue in the mid-'80s, and I will say, we would do modeling and analysis and projections. It was really easy to make 2030 sound like totally somebody else's problem. 2050, somebody else's problem. It's not somebody else's problem. It's all of our problems. It's here, it's today, it's the next building that you finance, it's the next heating and cooling equipment that you put in your house, it's the next car that you buy. So it's an imperative, and it is here, and it is upon us now to deal with. And I am enough of an optimist to believe that we do know how to solve these problems, but it's going to take a heck of a lot of political will and resources and alignment to make it happen. But it's not optional. It's just not optional. So, all right, let's dig into this a little bit. And I want to try to demystify as best I can a couple of things about, like, what do we mean when we talk about decarbonizing buildings?
Do you want to move your slides?
You could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what are we talking about? And I might venture to guess that I'm probably the only chemist in the room. So, and I'm not a financial person. So what I want you to do, though, is tell me when I'm not speaking English. And I mean that more broadly, because as a community, we have to start speaking together. We need to get our engineering community, our financial community. We have to start speaking one language around what it means to decarbonize our housing. So where do greenhouse gas emissions come from when we talk about the built environment? So there's a little pie chart up there, and there's one thing I want you to take away from this pie chart, and it shows the sources of greenhouse gas emissions in housing. And I'm just looking at the operation of a building, okay? And if you look at that, you see that big blue slice on the right, that's space heating and cooling. Half of our greenhouse gas emissions from housing is space heating and cooling. Add in water heating, and 65% of the emissions from the built environment are associated with that. Key takeaway, if we do not stop burning fossil fuel to heat water, to heat space, we will not decarbonize our built environment. So, you might hear, oh, I have a great energy project. We're going to do a lighting upgrade. Look at lighting. It's really small in most buildings because we've done great things over the past few decades to improve lighting efficiency. But that's not going to decarbonize the built environment. You sometimes hear a lot about cooking, right? And maybe we do want to take combustion sources in unvented environments out of homes. We're doing that for health reasons because that's a small slice. So key takeaway, we have to change and modernize our heating and cooling systems in buildings. And the way to do that is with high efficiency heat pumps. We have to reduce energy waste, and we have to use renewable power. We have to change the source of the electricity to power our buildings. Now, dense urban environments, you say, well, where does this renewable power going to go? Some buildings, we might be able to put solar on the roofs. Other properties, we're probably going to have to look at community solar, so connecting to regional sources of solar. And as Sadie talked about earlier, we have to transform our national power supply, our state, our regional, our local power supplies. And we have regions across the state that are making great progress in doing that. We have a federal administration that is committed to doing it. So the one thing I want to say, though, about modernizing the heating and cooling system, this is not rocket science. There are countries across the world today that are using high efficiency, modern sources like heat pumps today, even in cold climate environments. So we're not talking about technology that does not exist, but we are talking about massively changing what is standard practice. So that's why I feel like we can do this. The technology exists. And one little sort of funny story, I had hosted a delegation of building experts from Singapore a few years back. It was Earth Day, and we were in the financial district in Manhattan. And we took a break, and we're looking across the street, and I was with the head of the construction authority in Singapore. And we looked at the buildings, and all we saw were these big, old, clunky window air conditioners hanging off buildings. And the head of the construction authority said, "Oh, you still use those things?" Right? Because they've moved already years ago to modern, efficient things like heat pumps, which can be the lowest carbon source in buildings today. So simple takeaway, it's not rocket science. Technology exists. We just have to change our standard practices. So we need to know where the emissions come from. That's what this chart is attempting to show. Now, if you can move to the next slide, please. If you are an investor, a lender, a developer, you do need to understand your regulatory risk. If you were investing in a development next to a Superfund site, you would sure not do that until you really understood the environmental liability on the property. Well, this chart shows on the left the localities that currently have regulations on the books to reduce and regulate greenhouse gas emissions from existing buildings. And what's notable about that, you know, with a lot of regulations, there's grandfathering. Well, there's no grandfathering here. You know, in New York City and Boston and St. Louis and Washington, doesn't matter if you have an old building, you are going to have to come into compliance. So those are the states and the localities that have regulations today. And on the right, you can see the localities that are considering greenhouse gas emissions affecting buildings. So much like any other regulatory risk, as an investor, as a lender, as a developer, we have to be mapping out this greenhouse gas landscape from a compliance risk perspective, not to mention from a physical climate risk perspective, as Sadie and others have talked about. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So let's say you accept, okay, now is the time, we have to change the way we construct our buildings, the way we rehab our buildings. We want to seize this climate opportunity. Well, so what is this climate opportunity? Well, you know, simply stated, it is an opportunity to build pollution-free housing that is affordable, that is economically sustainable, and that can build and support healthier and more vital communities. So that's the goal. That's what we're going for. And you'll hear more about the federal funding that's available to do this, to help make it a reality. But that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build better housing, healthier housing, and address this climate crisis. So when we think about decarbonizing, I often like to think about new construction separately from rehabilitation and rehabs, because it is sort of a different world from a greenhouse gas mitigation perspective. If you're investing in a new development, a new housing development, the good news is we really know how to build a low carbon building today, and we can do that cost competitively with your garden variety polluting building. And when I was at NYSERDA, that's the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, we launched a program called Buildings of Excellence, and it was focused on multifamily housing, affordable multifamily housing, and low carbon housing. And the goal there was to show, you know, we can do this, we know how to do this. And what was really exciting to see in that program was that after a development team did maybe a handful, 3, let's say, developments focusing on zero emission buildings, a low carbon building. So again, that's a building with no on-site fossil fuel combustion. It's efficient. It's potentially using renewable resources on its own property or elsewhere. After they did a few, let's say 3 buildings, they were able to do the project at costs competitive with garden variety conventional buildings. And these buildings have lower operating costs. So better net operating income. They are also and can also be more resilient buildings because they are so energy efficient and they've reduced the volatility of the energy bills. If there is a power outage, these buildings can ride out a power outage longer. So we really know how to do this for new construction. Now, the world of rehabilitation, taking an old building and trying to change the heating and cooling system so it has a lower carbon footprint, it is a little more complicated. There is no doubt about it. And the retrofit cost and the complexity is going to depend on a number of different factors. The existing building condition, the shape and the type of the building, and it will be influenced by a few regional factors. Now, you might be saying, this is already too complicated, I don't even want to deal with this. So this is exactly what Climate United and CPC is trying to address head on, developing tools and assistance for a whole range of local lenders so that the process of supporting a decarbonized project is easier. We're talking about developing screening tools so you can more quickly identify an existing building where you could decarbonize it and actually turn around with better overall financial projections. So part of what we need to do now, today, is to recognize the buildings where we can move fast to decarbonize. There's going to be others where it's going to be a lot harder and we're going to need more resources. And we have to figure out how to do all of that and continue to support our goals of equity for communities across the country. So the chart, I just want to point out two things. So again, what kind of building might be amenable for a decarbonization? So changing out the heating and cooling system. If you have a building that is electrically heated, or so it has electric resistance heating, or it's being heated with oil or propane, that is a good candidate for a decarbonization heating and cooling equipment upgrade. The economics based on energy prices of that conversion has a pretty good chance of being positive. So the chart on the map on the left shows the regions where a conversion from a furnace and a boiler in housing to high efficiency, modern, low carbon equipment will be net positive over time. So the really dark green regions, you could see more than 90% of the housing units will have an overall reduction in life cycle cost. So there's a large swath of the country where this should be easy to do. Now, if you're up in the Northeast where you see, okay, 50% of the households can achieve this, again, doesn't mean it can't be done. We just have to get quickly to those buildings where the economics of a conversion will be positive. And again, what are those kinds of buildings? Well, electric resistance heating, propane, oil, heated buildings today. And we have 12 million households that are heating with those fuels. And most of those households are low and moderate income households. So there are, I'll call it low-hanging fruit buildings that we can get to that are low and moderate income buildings, and we can do this conversion. So again, we need more tools out in the industry so that we can recognize these low-hanging fruit more quickly and get the resources that's needed. So a couple of other things. When is the right time to try to think about, try to think about decarbonizing a building? We have to be able to plan this out along with your capital improvement plan and your refinancing plans. And I think that's something I would love to come back to in a bit. So let's jump ahead to this one slide here. So we do recognize that not all Not all buildings will be ready to decarbonize and replace their heating and cooling system at once. We have to meet developers, owners, where they are. In the states that are shown here in the red and the dark colors, those are states that have power grids that are dirtier than the average grid. In those states, if you save a little bit of electricity, you can have a very large carbon impact. So maybe it's a way to help a building owner get moving and make a little bit of an energy savings, but have a big carbon impact. So point being, some buildings will be ready for full decarbonization. Some buildings can make a step forward and start to think about a plan toward the long term. Last slide here. So how do you start this process? How do you endeavor to support a decarbonization investment? Where we stand today, you know, if you're a CDFI, you're probably going to need some third-party technical assistance to make sure it's a quality project. You know, I've seen projects go forward under the auspices of sustainability. They don't always work out the way intended, and I've seen projects work out perfectly. So you will need some help in the scoping of the project, a little bit of help in terms of understanding the impact on net operating income. You'll probably need that for closing. And then all the way to the end of this chart, and we can talk a little bit more about it, you're going to want to make sure that the equipment that you're financing, the sustainable equipment, was installed as planned. And importantly, if you're a developer, you're probably going to need something like an owner's rep to make sure that your construction crew, that your GC, that they are installing the equipment as designed, as planned, and it's operating as planned. So this is really important to deliver a quality product. These services, these third-party services, will ultimately decrease over time and just be integrated into standard operating procedures. But now, as we are at the early days, we will probably need to consider that and include that in the work that we do to decarbonize. And again, these are the kinds of things that Climate United and CPC is hoping and will support with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. The goal is to deliver better housing, and we do need to pay attention to how we do these renovations and designs. So look forward to a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. So now that we know how hard it is, we're going to jump into the resources, and we're going to start with Dale Bryk from Harvard. Come on up, Dale.
Oh, okay, thanks. Good morning, still morning, everyone. Yeah, so huge task and opportunity, and now we need to know where's the cash money that's going to pay for all this, because even though a lot of these things pencil out, there's still a lot of upfront money needed, and I'm here to tell you that there's a lot of money and we're going to do it. But the real challenge, I think, for us is we have this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of the IRA and all of the money that can flow to buildings. And are we going to be able to use that money to really figure out how to transform markets, transform the mortgage market, transform the way that we build and retrofit buildings, all the things that Janet was just describing? Or are we going to fail to get the money out the door, squander the money on light bulbs and little things that are not really going to do the job? Or, you know, spend the money and then fall off a cliff when that money is gone. So I think our collective challenge is to figure out how to capitalize on this opportunity together as an industry, because we're not going to see it again. So I'm going to show you some specifics on the money, but let me just first give you a quick little bit of background. So I'm Dale Bryk. I'm at the Harvard Environmental and Energy Law program. My background is in energy with Janet. And advocacy. I spent most of my career at Natural Resources Defense Council working on policy to help get money and policy to drive these things. And then I was in state government in the New York governor's office working with Janet and Sadie on on, I think, two things that are really relevant to this conversation. One was bringing housing and energy together, and how do we not see these as competing interests that are fighting for money, fighting for budget dollars, but think about how can we have a shared goal of more and better housing, and how can we think about bringing energy money into housing and overcome some obstacles that are, just perennial, like we have weatherization and low-income energy efficiency programs, but this house has, the roof is falling and it's full of mold, so not doing that house. We've got to overcome those persistent barriers so we can deliver these benefits to everybody. And the other challenge that we were working with in New York, this is 3 or 4 years ago, was we have the New York Green Bank, one of the largest green banks, by far the largest green bank in the country. They got $1 billion under ARA. I think they would be hard-pressed to show a meaningful fraction of that money that went into disadvantaged communities, a meaningful fraction of that money that went into buildings. And now we're in a completely different place. If we had $1 billion, I think we would spend 100% of that money in buildings in disadvantaged communities, and we would not run out of opportunities. So there is a sea change in where we were even 4 years ago to where we are, and the opportunity that we have and the conversations that we've had to bring all of these pieces together: housing, finance, energy, and climate. So that's what we got to do. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Let's see. Oh, I have the next slide. Sorry, I'm in control of the situation. Okay, so this is just a quick overview of only the biggest ticket items in the IRA that may be required, but at least can be used in buildings and in housing. So the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund has already come up, and I'm going to talk about that one in a little more detail in a second. I want to talk about the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program for a second before we get into that. The Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program is a $5 billion program at EPA, and that's really what my day job is about at Harvard. I spend all of my time bringing states together because that money is going to states, cities, and tribes. And you might be shocked to know that 46 of our United States have put their hat in the ring to compete for that $5 billion. We're talking Indiana, Texas, West Virginia. It's not just New York and California and Massachusetts. So almost all of the states are in that game. That program requires the states to put together climate plans. It's economy-wide, to go look at all of the other IRA money, including the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and these other pots. And after they've figured out how to deploy those resources to advance their plans, then they can come and say, I still don't have enough money. And guess what? One of the greatest opportunities are for them to not be able to find enough money is in buildings and housing, because the investment is so large. I mean, these are large sums of money where every single one of these pots is in the billions, and we often joke like we could just spend all that money in NYCHA. This money can all be spent, but that's why we have to spend it wisely so that we're using it to have transformative impact. So Climate Pollution Reduction Grant, talk to your cities and states. They are making plans right now. Those plans have to be filed on March 1st. The proposals for the money have to be filed in April. So I can tell you none of them have finished their plans yet, and they all need to hear from you about why those plans should incorporate housing and build on the great work that you are now planning to do. What else is in here? We have $3 billion going through block grants to communities focused in environmental justice and other disadvantaged communities. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of connective tissue holding all of these funding pots together. So, I'm spending a lot of time with the state saying like, hey, talk to your community-based organizations that are getting these other funds, and to community-based organization leaders saying like, hey, your states are getting this money. They're required to do community engagement, talk to each other. We have to figure out how to leverage these resources. And then we mentioned building codes briefly. I can imagine a lot of states putting building codes in their plans in order to be competitive for the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. There's money here for helping to implement those. For building materials, which is like a whole nother can of worms, so I think we're not going to get into that today. But the other resources are really important to think about. The Homes and HERA programs, these are incentives flowing through state energy offices for efficiency and electrification, everything that Janet was just talking about. And then lots of states have, of course, weatherization programs, utility funded low-income energy efficiency programs, which are now more and more supporting electrification. So there is a world of funding out there other than what's directly flowing through lending and finance, and that we have to think of holistically so that we're leveraging all of these resources. There we go. So let's get into a little bit of the detail of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, because that's where you guys can play a primary role in delivering those resources right into projects. So the National Clean Investment Fund is the one that we've mostly been talking about in the earlier panel, and that's really the lending capital. And I think the critical piece that we need to make sure we get right is just the technical assistance that Janet was talking about. You know, newsflash, but for low-cost finance, everyone is not sitting around saying like, oh, I wish I could electrify my building. So there are a lot of obstacles to get demand for this money to happen and to make sure that we know what we're doing, and we have the Janet Josephs of the world at our side helping us understand like what is the standard of performance that we need to meet in order to invest those resources. Then we have the Clean Community Investment Accelerator, CCIA. That's like seed money for 1,000 flowers to bloom and do this and get the capacity building. I think Carol Pettigrew talked about this a little bit because I know OFN is a leading contender for that application. You know, how do we build our own capacity to do this and make it the normal way that we do business? And then solar for all is a little bit of an odd duck here because that money is flowing to states, cities, and tribes primarily, although nonprofits can compete for it. And as the name suggests, it's mostly about solar, but I put it up here because there are resources there for building upgrades, including deferred maintenance, that you can't put solar on a roof if it's caving in. All of the resources for CCIA and Solar for All have to go into disadvantaged communities. So it's worth keeping everyone's eye on those, the flow of those dollars as well. Like the CPRG, the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, the GGRF is really trying to drive investment where the other IRA funds are not already providing what's needed, or, you know, tax credits and the like. So we're not really talking about utility scale renewables here, and buildings are a priority, and I think arguably could win the lion's share of the investment here. We do have guidelines in the NOFO, the notice from EPA, about, you know, the standard of investment, but they're very high level. So I think the work ahead to keep your eye on also is how are we going to make those standards more granular so that we know, yes, we're not investing in light bulbs, we're not investing in converting from gas to oil, but what is that least cost path to net zero wherever you are in, you know, the renovation of your building? What does that mean in real life? And then just additional detail on affordability. And then I think this is the last piece. This is just to give you a flavor of, you know, this is from the Homes and HERA rebate program. And like I said, there's utility and other programs. So, you know, there's lots of per unit things that are just out there to keep in mind when you're looking at the price tag, even for something that pays for itself over time. We need to get these upfront costs covered in order to do this work, especially in the communities that need it most. So I'm going to end there, and we can have more for discussion.
I think you're getting a sense of why they put this money with us. This is potentially more complicated than all the sources in our affordable deals. But let's go to HUD, which is a department that we're all very familiar with, and hear from Ethan Handelman.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Sadie, and thanks to Buzz and NAAHL for having me here. It's great to be in a room full of so many old friends and hopefully some new friends. Like Sadie said, I'm Ethan Handelman. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Multifamily Housing Programs at HUD, which means I get to oversee the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program, or GRRP. You can applaud for GRRP. Heck, thank you, Celia. Yeah. And there's only one slide, so there'll be no clicking. I realized as this panel progressed that this was not the Buzz Roberts roast that I had prepared for. So I'm going to leave the prepared remarks aside and just talk to you about the program because it's good. I have too much love and respect and admiration for Buzz to do any roasting. So what I'll tell you about is we have money to do the great things that you all have been talking about. And it's specifically targeted at the HUD-assisted rental buildings that otherwise often get left out of this. The acronym Green and Resilient Retrofit Program is terrible. The program is great. And it has two main components. One is about retrofitting buildings. That's most of the money. The other is about benchmarking to help guide buildings and our policy going forward. So I'll talk about both of those to give you a sense of what you'll be seeing as you're touching these properties and probably helping to finance some of them. Our funding for this comes from the Inflation Reduction Act. The only money that came directly to HUD in the IRA is to multifamily to do this Green and Resilient Retrofits program. It's $1 billion overall. There's a tiny bit for administrative costs, but more than $800 million of it is for direct funding of buildings to do the retrofits that are needed in the communities that frankly need it the most. And we've divided that into 3 cohorts just to make things fun and complicated. But actually, it helps us to meet buildings and owners and communities where they are and meet their needs without trying to be a one-size-fits-all. So the first cohort is the easiest one. It's the smallest one. We call it Elements. This is for the deals that are already in progress. Folks that are working on a refinance in a rehab right now, or doing a tax credit deal right now. You can basically pick from a menu and say, hey, I want to add solar, or I want to add high-efficiency HVAC system, or pick from that menu and make your deal greener and safer and healthier. Because that's what this funding does. It's the first time that HUD has put in the multifamily space resiliency to those climate events we know are more frequent and more severe, alongside energy efficiency to help be part of the solution of the climate crisis, and as a result, make the buildings healthier for the people that live in them. And all of those elements are coming together, and Elements allows you to do some of that in a deal that otherwise would just sail on its merry way. We've already made awards. We have made $18 million of awards in this, slightly a year after the legislation was signed, which in federal terms is like light speed. It's really fast. You can clap louder for that if you want. And now I'll talk about the second cohort, which is our Leading Edge Awards. Also, not a wonderful name, but a really good cohort. So these are for property owners who have a plan. They know how to get to net zero. They've assembled a team that knows how to get to net zero. And they're going to aim at one of several published standards for net zero or equivalent housing. It basically works that they apply, we make an award, they go off and do it, and then we check that they got the certification. It is the most hands-off way we do this. And it is one of the most appealing if you're a developer who really does have that team and that plan and are ready to go. We've already made more than $100 million of awards for this cohort. That was last month. And there will be more rounds to come for each of these because we have, like I said, $800 million plus in subsidy to deploy when we do it as loans rather than grants, and you can get either. But if we do it as loans, we stretch it further, and we have up to $4 billion of loan authority. So there's a lot more awards to come. The third cohort is the biggest cohort. That's our comprehensive cohort, and we're very close to making the first round of awards in that. This is the one that works for anybody. If you have a plan, you can come in and apply for a comprehensive award. If you don't have a plan and you just have a Section 8 contract in an older building and you come in and say, hey, look, I have a lot of need, help me figure it out, we'll do that too. Because for the comprehensive cohort, we have contractors for which we've already done a procurement that has completed. which itself is a miracle, to provide that due diligence support, to help figure out what should be in the scope of work, looking building by building, property by property, to find what works and maximize how far our subsidy can go. Just to give you a sense of the scale, in the comprehensive cohort, we can fund up to $80,000 a unit. That's a lot. This is not one of those where we put a nickel in and hope everyone else does, so we're all leveraged 20 to 1. We're putting real money into these deals to get them done. And we've deliberately designed it as a low barrier to entry program. It is one of the easiest applications I have ever seen, and I've been doing affordable housing work a long time, more than 20 years. I've written QAPs, I've worked with lenders and equity, like all sorts of folks in government, in consulting, in nonprofit advocacy. I've never seen an application this straightforward that still allows us to make good selections, do deals across the country, and target the greatest need. Pretty much all you need to do to apply for a comprehensive award is show us your energy efficiency need, and there's two easy ways to do that. You can benchmark, and I'll talk more about that in a second, using EPA's free software, Portfolio Manager, or you can use the tool we created for the places that can't benchmark. It's called MBEST. It's basically a questionnaire about your building, gives us a pretty good sense of what your energy efficiency needs are. The other thing you show us is your resiliency needs, your exposure to climate events. And that's just a calculation based on the National Risk Index. You don't have to do any homework. You don't have to write a narrative. You don't have to do a giant binder. That'll come later. That comes for closing. But just to apply, yeah, we all love closings, yes. But just to apply, you just need to show us your need, and we'll rank. And the program's oversubscribed. $1 billion sounds like a lot of money. It's not. In the multifamily portfolio, we have roughly 30,000 properties. In our assisted portfolio, we have roughly 18,000. And this is specifically for assisted housing. So Section 8, Section 202, housing for the elderly, Section 811, housing for persons with disabilities, right? The properties you know and love and have worked with a long time. We will hit hundreds of properties with this money, not thousands. So a lot of what we're trying to do is show what is possible. And I know in this room, many of you know what's possible. My panelists, co-panelists certainly know what's possible. And if we can demonstrate that, hopefully there will be more resources to spend. So let me take a minute to switch and talk about benchmarking, because you have now all heard me say multiple times, there is money, please tell people to come get it. Demand has been great. We have been oversubscribed for each of the rounds. There are 3 more rounds for each of these 3 cohorts to come. So over the next 10 months or so, there are going to be a lot of announcements, lots of those great, big, silly cardboard checks, right? We're doing that. We love it. And it pays for HVAC, and it pays for solar, and it pays for insulation, and all of the good stuff that we know that makes these properties that serve our residents healthier and safer and more efficient. But the benchmarking part is fun, and this is my inner housing nerd. I'm a housing nerd, yes. Wear that on my sleeve. And benchmarking is where we provide resources, consulting help at no cost to the property, so that they can use EPA's Portfolio Manager and track their utility usage and figure out what they're paying for water and electricity, right, for all of their utilities. It helps them see what they're spending and where they can make improvements. And if enough of them do it, which many are on track already, helps us see where we can make improvements in the portfolio, where there is further policy change to be done. One of the really cool changes we have already made with some of the Inflation Reduction Act funding is to directly connect the Portfolio Manager software from EPA to our IREMS asset management system, which is the finest technology the 1990s could produce. But what this means is that you no longer have to send us a PDF file or manually enter your data. You just click the box, because we only do it with permission, but you click the box in EPA Portfolio Manager, and we can pull it up in IREMS. And the data just flows, because it's, 21st century, we can do that. The goal with benchmarking is to get more of our properties doing that. This is not a thou shalt benchmark. We tried that years ago. You can guess how it landed. This is a wouldn't you like to be a pep or two? And by the way, we'll pay for it. We have a contractor selected. Their name is Leidos. Some messages have already gone out from multifamily on our listserv for property owners and stakeholders to say, hey, provide initial interest Tell us that you want to do this. We're now just about at the stage of, not say, yes, you really do, and we'll come out and get you set up. And that will be ongoing for a while. Together, the investments in properties that have already started, the investments in benchmarking, set us up to make sure that the assisted properties, the residents who need this help the most, are going to be part of it. The built environment is already starting to do it on its own. I've seen market rate properties that look like cool spaceships of the future and don't use a lot of energy. HUD properties should be able to be some of those spaceships of the future too. And so I'm really excited that we can be part of it. I know we will talk more about how it intersects with some of the other funding sources. We've done a lot of policy innovation and are continuing to around, for instance, solar, to make sure that it works with the Treasury's tax credits, it works with the EPA's efforts, it works with DOE's rebates and incentives, so that all of the funding can get braided, and we don't pay for anything twice. We only use $1 for each of the things that the dollar can do. But with the end goal of making it easier, making the barriers to entry low, making the execution effective and swift, and I think that's the direction we all need to be headed. So I'm excited for more discussion. I know we have limited time, so I will pass the mic over to Peter. Thanks very much.
Okay, so I have a lot of content to try to go through in 13 minutes and 35 seconds. I'm probably gonna have to race through this, so I wanna apologize right from the start. There's a much more resources in the NAAHL app. If you haven't downloaded it, do that, get more slides, and come up to me afterwards if you have any questions. And I will say, although I'm eating up to my limited time, I do wanna just take a moment to thank you, Buzz. We met 2 decades ago in early stages of developing legislation on the Housing Trust Fund and the Capital Bank Fund. I've really greatly appreciated your counsel, your friendship, and working together on a lot of policy wins over these 2 decades. So thank you, Buzz, very much. So I'm going to talk, we've already heard a little bit about the IRA spending provisions. I do want to just quickly touch on the rebate programs again. Dale brought them up. I think this is also a great flexible resource for both single family and multifamily housing that can help address some of the various retrofit needs, or even establishing new construction needs for energy efficiency and decarbonization. One thing I do want to just say is a lot of the policy decisions are right now in the hands of state energy offices. And so we really encourage you to reach out to your state energy offices. I know it's not maybe not your usual entity as housers in this group or community development groups. And actually, I forgot to introduce myself, Peter Lawrence, Novogradac. We are an accounting and consulting firm that does work in both affordable housing, community development, historic preservation, and renewable energy. So the climate opportunity is able to sort of meld a variety of our practice areas together to address a lot of these needs. And we know, we've talked a lot with housing offices. We do know that the state housing finance agencies, of course, allocate credits and a lot of other affordable housing resources. We're used to talking to them. We may not be as used to talking to energy offices, but I want to encourage everyone to do that, because decisions that state energy offices will make will, I think, have a tremendous impact on how effective the rebate programs will be to penetrate a lot of the communities and the types of housing that we all want to try to work on. So please do that. One thing in particular, the Department of Energy, when it issued its guidance to state energy offices, was silent on how the intersection of these rebate programs work with the low-income housing tax credit. And that was a bit of a victory, because we were really worried that DOE might just say, forget it, you can't use those together, which I think would be a missed opportunity. But it is incumbent on us to say, to try to avoid the 2 problems that we see potentially with rebate programs and housing credits. And that is the fact that federal grants, as a rebate is, do reduce your housing credit eligible basis, and they are taxable income. So the way that folks in this room have done all the time, and a lot of other resources from HUD, et cetera, and so forth, is to loan them in to the housing credit partnerships And that will take some guidance from state energy offices to execute. You also want to encourage state energy offices. DOE set rather broad, minimums. Only 40% for low-income families for all the resources, and 10% for low-income multifamily. That is in recognition that there's a huge difference between Wyoming and New York when it comes to multifamily opportunities and needs. But it is an incumbent on all of us to reach out to energy offices to say, you got to exceed those very broad minimums that DOE set up. So I know there's a lot more to discuss on the various spending programs, but I'm going to need to go to the tax side. There are some broad, the Inflation Reduction Act had a whole slew of resources. When initially there was estimated it was going to be $365 billion of resources on both the spending and tax side. More recent estimates suggest that it's going to be probably closer to $1 trillion. And much of that resource there are some various broad sort of cross-cutting components to it. One was there's this concept of a base rate. You're not going to meet the various bonus requirements. There's a base rate associated for a lot of the resources, and then there's a bonus rate for those meeting those. And those special circumstances are mostly focused on labor, because Biden administration had the Congress Congress felt it was really important to say we gotta marry getting good jobs along with decarbonizing and creating a more energy efficient environment. So there are this ability that for facilities that are over 1 megawatt and that started construction after January 29th of this year, you're going to have to meet prevailing wage or the apprenticeship requirements. I will say, for the housing audience here, that 1 megawatt is a pretty high threshold. The vast majority of facilities on multifamily properties, for example, are much less than 1 megawatt. It's between 150, I'd say, and 300 is where most of the sort of facilities are. So in some respects, for those you're worried about prevailing wage sort of increasing your costs, it's not going to apply to you. There's a bonus for domestic content. Right now, that's a really hard bonus to meet, but we anticipate over time that will change. And so maybe put that on the back burner for the time being. We do hear some folks are able to meet it, but we know that's going to be a hard one to meet. But energy communities is another one. I think when most people heard about energy communities, they have this vision of Appalachia, coal mines in Appalachia being closed. It's much, much broader than that. You'd be surprised if you take a look at the Department of Energy as a mapping tool. A whole sled of areas are actually qualified. It's brownfields. It's places where they had the fossil fuel industries had high employment or tax base, and your property may actually qualify for it. And we have tools in Novogradac too, also that you can layer on if you're in a difficult development area for low-income housing tax credit properties or a qualified census tract, where you can actually, the impact is even greater. So one of the first, of course, major tax incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act is the Renewable Energy Investment Tax Credit, which has largely been used to finance solar. And one of the big innovations in the Inflation Reduction Act is that you no longer have to reduce housing credit eligible basis by the amount of ITC, which had been a barrier to be admitted. Certainly you could do it but it was more complicated. Now it's for the extent that you add your ITC to your property, you no longer have to worry about its impact on the housing credit. So that's a big plus. And then there's also a bonus available. So you're starting at essentially 30% ITC, generally speaking. You could add 10 or 20% for facilities that are either in low-income communities or are serving affordable housing. And Congress set up a competition of 1.8 gigawatts, which sounds like a lot, but from what I hear from colleagues, it seems like there's very robust demand for that 1.8 in the current round that's coming. We're in the process right now. Folks are applying to DOE, and we anticipate Treasury to make awards by the end of the year. That is likely to be oversubscribed, all the various categories. There's a category for low-income communities, essentially that's new market census tracts. There's a category for native areas, and there's a category for affordable housing, and there's a category for low-income economic benefit projects. Think community solar, where at least half of the benefits are going towards low-income households. All of those areas, in fact, ironically, I'm hearing that perhaps the affordable housing one is going to be the one with the least demand compared to those other categories. So those of you who are still thinking about applying, I would still encourage you to do that. It says on the slide here that the bonus round closes November 18th. It doesn't technically close, but if you put in your application by that date, all of the applications are considered together. If you're after that date, you're likely maybe looking on the outside in because of the demand of the categories. Here's sort of a compilation of trying to what the picture of the world looks with the IRA as opposed to pre. Before IRA, you had a 26% ITC, and you had to reduce your eligible basis if you wanted to use ITC with your low-income housing tax credit property. Now you can go as high as 70%, and you don't have that problem with the housing credit. So it's an incredible different universe, almost tripling of the potential resources that you might be able to do depending on the variety of circumstances. And I do want to quickly mention there's also a whole new world that CDFIs we expect and banks to play in, and that is the idea of a direct payment or essentially a refundability for some of the tax incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act, or transferability, where you don't have to be an owner or part of the partnership in order to exercise the tax benefits. This is sort of an innovation. It's not been done before, really, in the community development space. And it will potentially broaden the investment pool. We've heard estimates that right now there's typically about $20 to $25 billion in traditional tax credit equity in renewable energy. This could be, as much as $50 billion of potential new investment through these channels. The one sort of little small downside I want to just mention is that it will be harder to monetize depreciation in that, so that's going to be a challenge you're going to think about. I'm running out of time, so I do want to just quickly go back to this. The point of this slide, which I'm not going to walk over too much, but is to say that with these innovations RA, combining solar for your property could go from being a cost to something that could be even a gap filler for your project because it generates more resources than the solar facility costs. I do want to quickly mention 45L. It's a credit that can be used to keep your properties energy efficient. It also no longer reduces housing credit eligible basis, and many states really have a threshold requirement in the QAPs to meet these standards, so you might as well get a credit for doing the work. And then there's also the 179D, which is another resource out there. I will say, unfortunately, this is the one that you still do need to reduce your housing credit eligible basis, so it may not work that extremely well with a housing credit, but maybe you have a year 15 property or a non-housing credit property that needs a moderate rehab for these. This is another set of resources, and again, depending on whether you meet labor conditions or not, you can get a significant amount of resources from that. So I apologize for how quickly I went through. I'll see if we have any time for questions.
So we only have a minute and a half left, so I don't think we're going to get to too many questions, but I wanted to just review and say that you definitely need an energy expert to understand exactly what you need to do. You need to go to your tried and true sources like HUD and not just access their resources, but work with them from a policy perspective to expand the work that they're doing to other programs so that the other programs start to include more support for energy efficiency and decarbonization. You definitely need a policy person like Dale at the tip of the spear, really probing and trying to get more resources and make it easier for all of us to figure out how to use them by bringing them through the state offices so you can access them. And then you're going to need Peter because lawyers and accountants always make sense in our business, but here it's really complicated. So, but I want to bring it back to something that I talked about initially, which is the first mortgage process, and give a shout out for Climate United, which is Calvert Impact, CPC, and Self-Help's application to the EPA for greenhouse gas reduction money. We are the multifamily component of that application, and our entire goal is to bring low cost. The money comes to us as grants. We want to bring it to you as we have to put it out as loans, but low cost, no cost, 0% forgivable loans at the very, very, very bottom of your capital stack, integrated with the first mortgage so that you don't have a second set of documents. There aren't other lawyers. There's not another application. But identify your first mortgage lender, bring them to CPC or to our partners. We're working with NeighborWorks Capital, who's going to be working with CDFIs and National Housing Trust, who's going to be working with housing finance agencies, and integrate the capital that we get seamlessly into your first mortgage process for two reasons: to teach the first mortgage lender what decarbonization means and how to do it, and to keep it as simple as possible, and to give you the incremental cost of additional capital that you need in the early phase of this transition to pay for the higher cost of electrification. To Janet's point, it's not that much anymore in new construction because it's getting a lot easier to do. But with existing buildings, you're going to need the $80,000 in some cases that Ethan pointed out, because it can be very expensive. So we're really trying to do both physical building transformation, but also capital markets transformation. So feel free to call me or any of my panelists for additional information. It was a lot to pack in, so I apologize. And I will turn it now back over to Buzz so we can get to the next panel.
Well, that was awesome. We're going to do a very quick panel change, so please don't leave your seats unless you are giving your mic back or getting your mic set up. And thanks, Sadie and everyone on the panel. Just a ton of information. If you didn't absorb it all, don't worry. The app has all those PowerPoints, and actually Peter's PowerPoint on the app has even more slides with more gory detail. So, and this panel, as all our panels, are going to be on the NAAHL YouTube channel and the NAAHL website. So you can go back and look at them again, and because it's a lot to absorb, especially for us housers who don't really necessarily understand the climate opportunity. It's going to take us a little while to absorb it. So how I see we've got folks lined up. We are running a little behind schedule, but it's okay because we had scheduled extra cushion for lunch. We will use it probably that way. In the meantime, this is a good opportunity for you to check your emails and texts and talk to your neighbors. But don't get up, don't you dare.